Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on existing building decarbonization codes, the game changer we need right now in the climate fight. As most of you know, we cannot address the climate crisis without tackling improved efficiency and electrification in existing buildings, but the question is how? Over the next hour, we'll hear from two speakers on ways to advance codes and policy to effectively decarbonize the existing building stock and bring us the scale we seek. With us today is Katrina Manigan, Director of Buildings and Homes for the Denver Office of Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency. Katrina's team's working to make all new and existing buildings and homes in Denver net zero energy, more sustainable, and more resilient. Today, Katrina will speak on the Energize Denver initiative, which combines efficiency and electrification requirements to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from existing buildings, and that's by 80% by 2040. In addition, we'll have MBI's Sean Denniston, who will share a new resource, the recently released Existing Building Decarb Code, or Decarbonization Code, that helps jurisdictions set clear and approachable pathways to cut carbon emissions through existing building codes. Sean's a senior project manager at MBI and one of the developers of that code. I'm Stacy Hobart. I'm Marketing Communications Director at New Buildings Institute. And before we begin, I have a couple housekeeping things to tell you about. First, you're muted, so we cannot hear you. This just keeps background noise down so that everybody can hear the speakers better. But I do want to direct you to the dashboard that should be viewable on the right side of your screen. If you're having difficulties with the technology or the interface of GoToMeeting, you can't see the slides or hear our speakers, you can use the chat pane to let us know, and we'll try to help you as we go. If you have questions, you can ask those anytime during the session using the question pane. We'll be taking questions most likely at the end of the webinar. If there's something specific that needs clarification, I'll go ahead and ask it during the presentations. But we really want to be able to have an opportunity to hear from Katrina and Sean at the end, just to be able to respond to things that you all want to dive deeper in on. And then at the end of the session, we'll be sending out a survey, and you'll be given the opportunity to give us feedback on the session. For those of you that are looking to receive AIA credits, you can provide your AIA number in the survey, and then we'll get those out to you. Finally, I just wanted to make sure to mention that this webinar is being recorded. So a link to the on-demand viewing will be available after. We'll send a notice out with that link, and then also a link to the slides. You can either, go back and review or share with others who you think might be interested in the information. So I'm just going to take a moment to go ahead and switch presentations here. Get Katrina teed up. And I'll go ahead, Katrina, and give you control. And we will let you go ahead and present.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Stacy, for the introduction. Thank you all for being here today. I will tell you about the work here in Denver to move existing buildings towards net zero energy. I'll start with a little bit of background information. Buildings and homes. Stacy, I don't think the slides are advancing for me. Do you want to give me that capability again?
Yeah, let me try here. Is it working? No. Okay. Katrina, just go ahead and cue me, and I'll move us through those.
Okay, go ahead and go forward 2 slides. So for a little background information, buildings and homes in Denver are responsible for 64% of Denver's greenhouse gas emissions. 15% of that is single family homes, and 49% is the commercial and multifamily buildings. And we have set a goal to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions in Denver by 2040 and have all new buildings be net zero energy by 2030 and existing buildings net zero by 2040. We go to the next slide. The policy we've had in place since 2016 is a benchmarking requirement This is a requirement that building owners over 25, owners of buildings over 25,000 square feet measure and report energy performance every year. And on the next slide, you can see how our energy use is doing based on that data. We know that all buildings, we're seeing an increase in energy use in Denver every year. Existing buildings are holding about flat, but we add 2% to our building stock every year. We are a growing city, and so we have energy use going up. A little more background information on the next slide about our office. We are really fortunate to have funding in the form of the Climate Protection Fund. This is a sales tax funded fund that was approved and voted on by voters in Denver in 2020 that funds our office to the tune of $40 million every year. So in addition to sort of knowing we have really ambitious goals, we have real funds and resources to help support this transition. And I'll turn back to telling you a bit about how we're spending some of the funds over on the right side around energy efficiency in buildings and homes. And it touches on these other areas that are the allowable uses of the fund also. One last piece of background information. We have two big guiding plans for our work. And I'll mostly be mentioning some of the outcomes of the right-hand one, our renewable heating and cooling plan today, but we also have our net zero new buildings and homes implementation plan. And these have really informed and been grounding for the policies that we're now have in place and are putting in place. Well, and the credit to New Buildings Institute for helping us a lot, especially with the new building and home implementation plan. If we turn to the next slide, I would just want to spend a little minute because we're going to talk about, as Stacy mentioned, both the energy efficiency and electrification policies that we're working on here in Denver. And I know for many folks, why electrification is still a bit new. So let me just frame that through a quick series of slides. So first, if we go, we know that gas use in buildings is about 30% water heat, 67% space heat. And that varies, of course, a bit by building type, but things like cooking, clothes drying is a very small portion of natural gas use in buildings. If you go to the next slide, we know that moving away from that gas use has really high impact climate benefits because gas comes with methane emissions. Natural gas is mostly methane, and it leaks at least in small amounts when we use gas, and methane causes 80 times the amount of climate change as standard carbon dioxide emissions. And here in Denver, we're very fortunate that we have zero emission electricity coming. Xcel Energy, our local utility, is regulatorily bound and committed to deliver 85% renewable energy by 2030. You go to the next slide, just a little more background on electrification. What do we mean when we talk about electrification of space and water heat? We're talking about heat pumps. They move heat instead of creating it with 200 to 300% efficiency. This is the same technology that is in your refrigerator today. If you go to the next slide, and this is really an old, proven, reliable technology. It's been around since the 1800s and for decades used to heat buildings and homes in Europe and Asia. The next slide, we often get questions, can we move all this heating load onto the electric grid? In Denver, our electric system is built to withstand really high air conditioning load during the summer. So we can move, and we've done the analysis, as has our utility, we can move a lot of that winter heating need to renewable electricity without significant infrastructure build out. We're planning how to partially electrify homes and buildings for existing homes and buildings to utilize sort of the existing electrical capacity that's in buildings and homes already for cooling that the grid is already built out for. If you go to the next slide, there's other benefits from electrification around improved equity and safety. In particular, we know 30 to 40% of low-income homes in Denver have gas equipment that fails carbon monoxide tests. And all of our energy efficiency work is really helping to lower energy bills and reduce the energy burden. So the last slide on this is the we're going for better outcomes for the same cost or very similar cost with electrification. We're looking to move to heat pumps instead of gas water heaters, instead of air conditioners. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, I'll give just a little background on how we got to the policies that you want to hear about, because I think that context is really important. Sean asked me to talk about some of the challenges behind moving in this direction, behind decarbonizing buildings. And we put these challenges directly to this really diverse group of 25 people. So we formed the Energize Denver Task Force in January of 2021, and we challenged them to tell us how the city could improve health, improve equity, create jobs, and bring existing buildings to net zero energy by 2040. And they reached a consensus set of recommendations that, on the next slide, they felt like really strike the balance between being achievable and affordable and fiscally attainable, getting eager compliance from building owners while still being effective and driving kind of that culture change and challenging and involving the community. These were the words they gave us about their goals for this ordinance. So with that background, they went through an 8-month process to develop these recommendations. They spent a lot of time grounding all of this work in equity and giving us a lot of direction. And so I'll tell you more about how we're doing really equitable implementation towards the end. But first, what are the Energize Denver regulations? So I'll cover those on the next section. So if we go to the next slide, you can see the 3 pillars of the Energize Denver ordinance. The first is benchmarking. That's been in place since 2016. The second is a set of performance requirements to require site energy use intensity to be improved 30% by 2030 for buildings over 25,000 square feet, and prescriptive lighting or solar requirements for smaller buildings. I'll go into that a little more in depth in a moment. And the next part is a set of electrification requirements that require all the commercial and multifamily buildings to partially electrify space and water heating equipment upon system replacement when cost effective. And I'll go into the details of how that phases in shortly. So the next slide, you can see a little more detail on the energy performance requirements. This is for the buildings over 25,000 square feet. It uses site energy use intensity as the metric, and targets were set for every building type according to Energy Star Portfolio Manager building types, set at the 85th percentile for all covered buildings in Denver. So 15% of buildings are already performing at these energy use intensity levels or better. 85% of the buildings in Denver will have to make improvements. And the target energy use intensity you see here, energy use per square foot on the right, is measured in kBTUs, is a 2030 target for those buildings. And there are flexible options to adjust the timeline, adjust the target. There's a separate process for agricultural and manufacturing buildings. There's a lot of details to this, but this is the high level framework. The next slide is our small building requirements for those 5 to 25,000 square foot buildings. They have to perform either a lighting upgrade or solar installations, and those sort of phase in down to the smaller buildings by 2027. If you go to the next slide, there's a little more detail here on the electrification requirements. So again, we're really encouraging building owners in Denver now to put in place a plan for equipment replacement. When they replace their equipment, these are the requirements that are going to phase in to the building code. So we will be amending the Denver Building and Fire Code as a part of a larger building code update that I'll touch on later. And here, later this year, we will be amending with the 2023 requirements, where there will be a permit process change so that there's near parity in permitting between gas systems and heat pumps. Because today it's much easier to get a quick permit for a like-for-like gas system than to go through the permitting process for a heat pump. Then 2025, we'll start to require heat pumps upon replacement for those easier to electrify equipment like furnaces, rooftop units, individual water heaters, when cost effective. And then in 2027, we'll phase in the requirements in code to require, upon replacement, the harder to electrify systems to move to heat pumps like PTAX, boilers, central hot water, and again, when cost effective. If we go to the next slide, I'll talk through some of the support and resources that we're putting in place for our community to help them through this transition. So if you go to the next slide, the Energize Denver Hub is going to be the landing place for all of this. So if you want to learn more about the regulations, the support, all the work happening in Denver, go to denvergov.org/energizedenver. This is sort of everything for existing buildings. We're going to have a lot more resources coming soon. There's technical assistance. There's a phone number building owners can call or to get help. There'll be how-to guides, checklists. We're designing a lot of additional assistance for under-resourced buildings, and I'll talk about that more in just a minute. And then we are also rolling out a lot of electrification support because we know that is newer for our community. So next slide, we'll turn to that electrification support. Here's the kind of 3 pillars of what we're developing to support building owners through this transition. We have feasibility reports that will be required if you're going to put in a gas system. Are there 2 out of the 3 things that owners can pick from or contractors can pick from as permitting becomes equal? And this is an electrification feasibility report. People have to start to look at what would it take? Does it make sense to add a heat pump in my building when I'm replacing the air conditioner, when I'm replacing the furnace, when I'm replacing the water heater? Those won't be quick permits. And this feasibility report will have incentives with it so that we are helping pay for a lot of those early studies of would it make sense when I replace my equipment to electrify. We're rolling out pilot projects, and you can find those applications on that website on the Energize Denver Hub. We'll start funding the installation of heat pumps in some of the furnace based systems, replacing times when air conditioners are getting replaced, individual water heaters. And then we're rolling out incentives at scale through sort of starting next year. So that we're capturing, hopefully a lot of the equipment replacement will be heat pumps starting in 2023. And our goal is that at least 10% of those kind of easier to electrify buildings are putting in heat pumps, not like for like gas systems. Next slide, I want to tell you a little bit more about what we're doing to develop really focused outreach and support for our most under-resourced buildings because they need these energy efficiency improvements and the indoor air quality improvements the most. And then I'll wrap up. So if we go to the next slide, you can see some of our criteria to identify under-resourced buildings. Denver has nest neighborhoods, which are our most under-resourced neighborhoods identified kind of citywide. There's buildings with affordable housing or otherwise serving frontline communities, buildings with human service providers, buildings of significance to community members. And we are out in all of our under-resourced communities finding out which buildings these are. And we're going to soon be publishing a social equity index that layers in utility burden, income stress, heat island, asthma rates, redlining, a lot of different elements. And so you can watch that Energize Denver Hub for that soon so that we target resources towards those buildings. Last slide on this is just showing how we're involving the community in the decision-making process. They are a co-designer, so click through all of this so the whole slide comes up. We've been doing a lot of community engagement outreach in our most under-resourced neighborhoods, engagement with building owners and community members. And out of all of that, we are starting to get final input on the initial set of services and technical support that we'll offer to our under-resourced buildings. We're also going to spend half of our incentive dollars and half of our pilot dollars for electrification pilots in under-resourced buildings. And so we're doing really targeted engagement and making sure all of the pilots and incentives are designed, because we have a mandate from our community in the Climate Protection Fund to spend half of our city dollars in under-resourced buildings, if not more. Next slide, just to briefly mention the greenhouse gas outcome. The Energize Denver Ordinance and this combination of policies and programs will reduce emissions from commercial and multifamily buildings in Denver 80% by 2040. And then next slide, I'll just briefly mention our code update process. This is really focused on new buildings, but of course, existing buildings will kind of go through major renovation and fall under this code sometimes. So I'll briefly mention, watch for more updates from Denver later this year as we move forward with code adoption. You can see where we expect our commercial and our residential code may fall, highlighted in the green cloud. The orange dots are where the national model codes have been. The blue dots are where Denver's code has been, as compared to our path towards net zero energy new buildings. And that blue dashed line represents that trajectory needed to meet Denver's goals. And we just, want to note that we're working to align that code with Energize Denver as much as possible. And that's it. So I'll pass the presentation over to Sean so you can learn all about the NBI existing building decarbonization code. Here, though, is my email address. Do feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
Thanks, Katrina. And I do want to say there's quite a few questions in the question pane. I think I do want to ask you one, just because I think it's so germane to what you just presented before I move to Sean.
Great.
You mentioned, so how do you did you guys come up? So you talk about cost effective, how did you? What's the methodology that you used to determine what cost effectiveness was, or is that still something you're sorting out?
We will be developing a much more robust methodology for determining what's cost effective before we start using that test in 2025, based on everything we learn from all the electrification feasibility reports we'll be funding and requiring, and the pilots and incentives we're running. But the way it's defined in the Energize Denver Ordinance is that the cost of the gas system, if you were going to put in a like-for-like system, will be compared to the cost of installing a heat pump system, at least a partially electric system, or it could be the cost of the air conditioner compared to the heat pump. And then we'll factor in the social cost of carbon for both of those systems, and any incentives available to both of those systems. And as long as it falls within 5 to 15% of cost parity, then starting in 2025, the heat pump would have to be installed. And we will still be offering incentives at that point for under-resourced buildings to make sure they are at cost parity, not just near cost parity. So that's the language laid out in the ordinance. And I can just drop in the chat so everyone can see it, just a link to the sort of actual legal language, and we'll be developing a lot more detail in terms of how that's exactly implemented.
Great, thank you, I appreciate it. That's helpful. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and swap presentations here and go ahead and invite Sean Deniston to present. And like I said, we'll keep kind of going through your questions. We'll get to as many as we can at the end and answer as many as we can along the way. Anything that we don't get to, we can follow up, no problem. So I just want folks to know that if your question doesn't get answered, we'll go ahead and make sure that we summarize, the ones that we can't respond to on this webinar and send a note out to the registrants and let them know, share the information. So Sean, go ahead, and if you want to I'll just go ahead and advance the slides if that's easier.
I think I've got it.
Oh, you've got
So,
control. Awesome. Okay.
yes, I'm in
Thank
control.
you.
Thank you, Stacy. And thank you,
Okay.
Katrina, for that great presentation. So we are going to talk now about what it takes to take the sort of work that Denver is doing and really bring that to scale and bring that to other jurisdictions. And I want to start with a little bit of background. So buildings represent 75% of the energy consumption in the US, 50% of fossil gas consumption, so natural gas, and the net result is 39% of US emissions are from buildings. And of course, those are existing buildings because they are buildings that are in use. And as we begin to think about how we address these emissions issues, it really becomes important to consider not just the climate, but also equity. And so we are beginning to see this in the policies that are out there of climate policies that address our climate crisis, but do it in a way so that outcomes are no longer determined by race, so that those who are most impacted and the most potential for negative impact are really at the forefront of the considerations. So everything that we are doing here in these policy options really has this in mind. And we really want to highlight that up front. So how are codes actually established? Stacey, I think every time you move your cursor, you take control back. It looks like I have lost control. So Stacey, I'll let you just advance. So just as a little bit of background, in the US, most codes are adopted at the state level. And so there really is this jurisdiction by jurisdiction approach to bringing your construction codes to the jurisdiction. And we have a vast patchwork of codes. They are at different levels, they use different model codes. In some states, local jurisdictions get to adopt the code, in other states they don't. In some states, there's limited local adoption opportunities. So with this big patchwork, we really need a replicable approach because we can't just do it in one place, but we need to put something out that makes it easier for the local jurisdictions. Next. But as we are looking at these, really decarbonization goals, we're also beginning to see that we have, electrification and decarbonization mandates adopted in some states, while we are seeing legislation that prohibits local restrictions on gas use in other states. And so there's this kind of conflicting set of regulations that are really at play in how local jurisdictions can approach these issues. Next slide. And if we overlay that with the states that have set emissions reductions targets, we can see that some states are in a really good position to be reducing their emissions, while other states, they may not have the mandates and they may actually have limitations coming from state legislation. And because of that, we need policies that can be flexible and that can really adapt to these very different situations. Next. And that's why New Buildings Institute has put together this decarbonization toolkit. And it really has these three major pieces. We have the technical resources, which are the new construction building decarbonization code, which we released last year, the existing buildings decarbonization code, which we're going to talk about today, but then some additional resources that we're not going to talk about as much, but I just want to make you aware of the policy resources like one-page fact sheets and a cost study for new construction for single-family homes and offices for the new construction decarb overlay, and then some advocacy frameworks that can be used to help bring this sort of thing to your local jurisdiction. Next. And this whole toolkit is really based on our 5 foundations of zero carbon building policies: energy efficiency, renewable energy, grid integration and storage, building electrification, and thinking about life cycle impacts. And that would include embodied carbon. Next. And as we turn these foundations into actual strategies, that means bringing energy efficiency strategies into the policies, thinking about the major fossil fuel end uses like space heating, water heating, and cooking, but not forgetting the minor fossil fuel end uses like clothes drying, you might be surprised, but lighting and other miscellaneous things, fireplaces and other loads. Next. But it also means looking at supportive decarbonization strategies. So these might not result in immediate or direct decarbonization, but can support decarbonization or can support decarbonization in the future. So things like electrification readiness, grid integration, more renewable generation, electric vehicles, energy storage in buildings. And the toolkit has all of these sorts of strategies involved. Next. We can look at the basic structure of how this overlay is created, because it is meant to be an overlay. It's a set of code requirements that sits on top of your existing energy code. And so we've structured it in ways for this kind of flexibility. So there is an all electric path where you actually require electrification, but then there's a mixed fuel path where you don't necessarily require electrification, thinking back to that map with the red. We include requirements for both residential and commercial building types. Because the energy code is a construction code, we have lots of different construction events that the code applies differently to. And so this includes new construction, which is the overlay that we released last year. But then, oh, can you go back? Then we have additions, alterations, and changes of occupancy, which really gets at existing buildings, and that's the overlay we're about to talk about. And of course, we think about the different systems, HVAC, water heating, lighting, and power. Now, next. As we went into the development of the 2024 IECC, NBI with RMI have launched our Codes for Climate Initiative, and we engaged local jurisdictions representatives about what are your priorities for the next model code. And we could see, the jurisdictions really had an emphasis on decarbonization and electrification. They were also thinking of thermal and passive resilience for extreme weather events. They were looking at EV integration, embodied climate, and then climate hazard resilience. And when they were thinking about whether residential or commercial was more important, a lot of them really did see them being as equally important. Some, if they thought that one was more important than the other, it was generally residential over commercial. But for the most part, they believed it was the same importance. Next. But I think this is one of the most telling things that we heard back from them, which is this question of existing buildings and new construction, that such a large portion believed that existing buildings are more important to advance faster. And that's really where our existing buildings decarb overlay comes in. Next. Because we can see that this has been a general trend. If we go all the way back to the beginning of kind of energy regulations in the 1950s and the first residential standards for federally insured loans and utility bill reductions, then moving into the 1970s, where you begin to see your first actual energy codes, and the transition into the 1990s, where the emphasis was really on market leadership. And so you saw things like Energy Star and LEED really taking the center stage. But then in the 2000s, there was more of a focus on what it meant for a building to be an actual building in use. And so more focus on compliance, making sure that those buildings were actually built to the codes that they were subject to, and then beginning to look at disclosure. In the 2010s, we saw a shift to zero energy, and we begin to see zero net energy really emerge, and we see some certifications. But now in the 2020s, there's a flip again, a pivot to carbon, equity and environmental justice, and then existing building performance and building performance standards, like you heard Katrina talking about the Energized Denver version in Denver. Next. And so into this kind of word soup of things that you can do to address existing buildings and decarbonization. Next. We have the existing buildings decarbonization code. And before we dig into it, next, I want to talk a little bit just about how it's structured, because I think that that's a really important way to keep it in mind as we're going. So it is a series of actual code modifications for the IECC, and it's the legislative language that you need to modify your code, and that's what you see at the top with the underline, and then narrative language which is the gray italic that describes what this code language does. So you don't have to be a big old code nerd like me. You know, you can look at each of these sections and see what the code language does, but you need the legislative language to actually do the adoption. And for each code concept in the overlay, we have this, the actual code language, and then the description of what it does. Next. So I'm trained as a preservationist. So I think of an existing building in terms of its life cycle, that there are different parts of it, the structure, the site, the equipment, and they all have different life cycles. And each of those life cycles creates opportunities. Next. So the decarb, oh, you went too far. The decarb overlay then looks at these opportunities in the life cycle of a building and uses them as decarbonization opportunities to influence the life cycle of a building. And so we have these topics: efficiency, there's electrification, full or partial, depending on the path that you're in, electrification incentivization, electrification readiness, electric vehicle charging requirements, requirements for on-site renewables and solar readiness, and grid integration. And so when we look at these topics next, we can see how they might overlap with the life cycle of a building. You know, every 30 to 50 years, you might have major renovations creating major opportunities. Next. Every 15 to 30 years, you have HVAC replacements. Again, another opportunity for a different kind of decarb retrofit. Next. Lighting retrofits create another opportunity every 5 to 7 years. Next. Leasing happens generally every 2 to 7 years, depending on the real estate market, often coming with tenant improvements. There, another opportunity for decarbonization. Next. And then just other events, you know, whether those are remodels, repairs, additions, sale, a market repositioning, and each of those provide these additional opportunities for decarbonization retrofits. And these are the opportunities that are leveraged in the decarb overlay. Next. So let's look at some of those kind of big overarching ideas. We'll start with additions and just think of how it's addressed in the overlay. In general, the additions are treated like new construction, so they would need to meet the requirements that we established in the new construction decarb overlay. We differentiate between small and large additions because those different scopes create different opportunities for decarbonization. And we differentiate between new systems and system extensions. You have opportunities for new systems that you don't necessarily have if you're just extending the system, but that doesn't mean that when you extend the system, you don't have any opportunities. Next. And then we look at change of occupancy. It's meant to work with the alterations requirements that we're going to discuss in a moment, but there are some specific requirements for change of occupancy because, again, that change of occupancy creates opportunities for doing building decarbonization. Next. And really the big meat of it is alterations. We have a whole series of different types of requirements. We have discrete system replacement requirements, so this would be just your equipment replacement, opportunistic supportive retrofits, and I'll talk about what that means, looking at substantial improvements, and then a new concept, I think, for just about everyone online here is going to be substantial energy improvements and using that as an opportunity for decarbonization. Next. So first, let's look at the system by system. So we have some that just kind of fill in some holes for the 2021 IECC, ensuring that HVAC systems are sized correctly, which shockingly, the code does not require right now, expanded acceptance testing, upgrading controls, looking at system level or for full or partial electrification. So you're just impacting your space heating system, requirements for electrification of just that system. And then some more nuanced things like requiring a heat pump when you're replacing the air conditioner and then using that heat pump as the primary heating system. So looking at these real just system by system discrete opportunities. Next. And the opportunistic retrofits means identifying the types of construction events in the lifetime of the building that kind of give you an opportunity to more cost effectively do a decarbonization retrofit or a partial decarbonization retrofit. So thinking about things like if you do really a full roof replacement. We're not just talking about recovering in this case, but ripping the old roof off and putting a new one on. There's an opportunity to also require solar to match new construction requirements. Could do partial EV infrastructure with different events in the parking lot, such as if you are ripping out your old paving, that's a great opportunity to put in the conduit for a future EV retrofit. You may not put everything in, but you've got that equipment on site, it's a good opportunity. Looking at any time a panel replacement is done in a building, that it's done with electrification in mind, so that even if the building isn't, say, replacing its heating system, if they are replacing their panel, make sure that new panel is big enough so that they can replace the heating system in the future. So really thinking about these events and maximizing the opportunity. Next. But then also looking beyond just these discrete events, that the building life cycle has some of these less common, more substantial construction events that we really need to make the most of. And oftentimes we see people talk about the market of major renovation, and there's no definition for major renovation in the code. However, the code does have a requirement for substantial improvements. And this matches what most people think of when they think of a major renovation. So this creates an opportunity to use an existing code threshold to attach more significant requirements. And you can read this. This is in your code book right now. Maybe you haven't used it in the past. It's certainly not used in the energy code right now, but we're leveraging this existing trigger. Next. So for a substantial improvement that has a substantial scope, that also has a substantial budget and probably has financing involved, we can begin to think about having requirements for things like full electrification in the all electric path, or electrification readiness in the mixed fuel path. So this really mirrors what we have in the new construction overlay. We can start to apply energy performance targets that, that building after this substantial improvement has to meet a minimum standard, and you can begin to tie those to your BPS. You can begin to think about your on-site renewables requirements just as if they're new, or the EV installation, the EV infrastructure requirements that are in the code, as being that you can have the same requirements that you do for new construction, really leveraging that opportunity of scope in a substantial improvement. Next. And then this one is something that's new, and we've defined a new term called a substantial energy alteration. And NBI has been working on this for a while, where at what point do you have enough of an impact on the energy systems of the building that you can then begin to require more efficiency? And we looked at substantial improvement. That's great, but it is a pretty high bar, and you could have major impact on your energy systems and not hit that substantial energy improvement. I mean, the substantial improvement. In the existing buildings codes, the international existing buildings code, there are level 1, 2, and 3 alterations that define varying levels of substantial alterations, with the level 1 being the lowest and level 3 being the highest. And that makes a certain amount of sense, but the scopes for those are really based on the sorts of alterations that impact egress and accessibility, not necessarily the energy systems. So we've defined a new term, substantial energy alteration. It's modeled on something that's already in the code called a substantial structural alteration, that has a set of requirements where you have to do more once you make a substantial impact on a building system. In that case, it's the structural system. In this case, it's the energy systems. And what we've done is we've set this threshold that you have 4 major energy systems in an existing building: the envelope, HVAC, hot water, and lighting. And if you replace more than half of 2 of those systems, that's a substantial energy alteration. So it's a major impact on 2 or more systems. Next. And then what we do with it is we provide a way to finally make existing buildings subject to the C406 additional energy options requirements. So in 2021, these are credits. New buildings have to achieve a minimum number of credits, but alterations and additions didn't have to comply with this section at all. And by using this threshold, we say if you have a substantial energy alteration, you do have to get a certain amount of credits. The credit threshold is lower than new construction, recognizing that existing buildings, things are a little bit more challenging, but you can get that additional efficiency when you have a big impact on the energy systems. Next. And then there's just a few more types of requirements. We have electrification incentivization. So these are requirements that don't actually require electrification, but might give project teams a little bit of an extra incentive to choose electrification rather than continuing with mixed fuel. So requiring an electrification phase out plan, that might sound familiar. That's basically Katrina described their electrification feasibility study. It's a very similar thing. You can require low nitrous oxide furnaces to improve the emissions of furnaces if they're going to stick with natural gas. Begin to test natural gas piping because methane is a far more potent greenhouse gas than carbon is, so ensuring that we don't have leaks in these existing buildings, and requiring higher efficiency for mixed fuel buildings. And next. And then the last pieces that we have in the overlay are specific requirements to connect the energy code more closely with building performance standards. So if your building performance standard is going to be successful, you really do want the assistance of the energy code so that when buildings are going through construction events, you're not missing the opportunities to help them meet the building performance standards. We're really beginning to see the adoption of building performance standards across the country. And we have requirements in the decarb overlay. For example, if a jurisdiction has a BPS, then any alteration that the building owner wants to do, they have to submit a report that has the current DUI, the target DUI, and then if the building doesn't meet the next target, what's the plan for getting that? Really ensuring that building owners and project teams are thinking about the building performance standard targets anytime they do a project and how that project can help support the building meeting those standards. And if we think back on all of the efficiency requirements that we've talked about up till now, these are really high value opportunities to go beyond what the energy code already is doing for existing buildings, so that when they go through these other construction events, they are better able to meet the building performance standards. Next slide. So passion has led us here. Where do we go from here? Next slide. The existing buildings decarb overlay can be used in whole or selecting bits of pieces based on what is most appropriate for your jurisdiction. Maybe you do a cost analysis like Denver did to know which of these requirements make sense in your local market. But you can then use whichever pieces you choose to do things like develop incentive programs. It doesn't have to be a code, whether those are cash incentives or development incentives. Any kind of incentive can be attached to these requirements. It can be used for municipal retrofits so that the jurisdiction is leading the way in the local market, building market and building pilot studies. It can be used to amend BPS provisions to support local implementation. So you can think of these as being code requirements that you can adopt to help ensure that your BPS is going to be successful. Or you could just adopt these in your next code update at your jurisdiction. Again, picking the ones that are appropriate for your jurisdiction. And then finally, a little shout out for what you can do to have an impact beyond just your own jurisdiction. And that's the support of the adoption of requirements like these into the national model codes so that everybody can benefit from them. And with that, we can open for questions. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sean. That was great. There are quite a few questions, so I've been trying to go through and sort of prioritize them, and I think, some of these are targeting, one of the speakers, but I think if you, if it's for Katrina, Sean, if you have something to add, please feel free to chime in. So I think, the cost-effective piece was something that we addressed previously, and there was quite a few questions around that. I think one of the questions came in around HFCs from heat pumps. So, and Sean, I think this applies to the work you're doing too, but how, so if you're trying to install heat pumps for electrification, but then you have this HFC issue, how do you balance those and make sure that you've got, low global warming potential refrigerants, and you're not creating another problem. And then just a question about, would Energy Star Portfolio Manager be an effective means to manage that?
So I can start with the question about the refrigerants. We have the advantage of refrigerants already being a big topic that are receiving a lot of attention and technological advancement. And so we are seeing refrigerants come through with lower and lower global warming potential. We also do have standards around leakage, and accidents are always a concern, but when you have quality installations, accidents are far less likely to happen. So there is kind of this balance. And as a local jurisdiction might be looking at the opportunities for doing decarbonization retrofits with heat pumps, one of the things to keep in mind is, Katrina was identifying these different waves of their requirements. And one of the things is some of those simple ones have less refrigerant. When you're just talking about replacing a furnace, that is less refrigerant lines than, say, if you're putting in a large, multi-split heat pump for a whole bunch of locations. But it's also important to keep in mind that, if you have AC, in a lot of cases, you have many of those refrigerant lines already. Some heat pump systems will require more refrigerant lines than you need for just AC alone. But I think it's a nuanced thing that you can't just answer one way or the other. And the longer we get, because of the advancement in refrigerants, I think the less of an issue it will become. And I think Katrina would be well positioned to answer the other part of the question.
I agree with Sean's answer on that part. I actually forget the other part. My apologies.
So just around, is Energy Star a place where we can track this, in Portfolio Manager?
I don't believe Portfolio Manager has the ability to track refrigerants, but it's something we're monitoring. But as Sean said, for a lot of these simpler systems where our policy is really focused in early days, they won't take a lot more refrigerant or any more refrigerant than the air conditioner that's already there. And so it's something that we're tracking.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But I know the space is improving. It's sort of just something we're not working on directly, but something we're just monitoring as refrigerants improve.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So this, Katrina, was dedicated or indicated for you. So since cooling and heating loads, so summer, winter, okay, so heating loads as well as summer, winter PV electricity production are not symmetrical. In other words, just not the direct relationship there. How is the existing PV grid sufficient? And there were a number of questions that sort of related to this. You kind of indicated that, the infrastructure was able to deal with the sort of increases in electrification load. There were some related to Xcel, like how is Xcel decarbonizing and delivering on that promise? But if the current, PV grid or the either bulk PV or distributed PV, is that already sized to meet sort of the increased winter electricity loads that'll come with this transition to heat pumps? And can you talk a little bit more about that?
Maybe. Stacy, is it possible to share my slide deck again? I think I had one extra slide asked after my contact information, because I see a number of questions about the grid. And I almost included it, but it was already long as it is. So if you go to my final slide, you will see after the thank you, the analysis. And I put a link to this in the answers to the questions. This is from our renewable heating and cooling plan. And here you can see our analysis of building electrification. On the orange is the summer peak load on our grid. The blue on top of that is the expected 2030 electric vehicle charging load that our utility is already planning for. In Gray, you see the winter peak load. And so I know we analyze the projected sources of electricity in the winter. So like you're asking, PV production is lower in the winter. That was part of this analysis. And we ran a bunch of scenarios that looked at sort of, and really, I think the one we're pursuing through policy and incentives is this sort of balanced scenario where we're doing partial electrification of existing buildings. And as you can see, if you look at the right-hand graph, we can electrify 50% of the buildings through that balanced approach, and we're still nowhere near our summer peak. So we should be able to electrify really almost all of the buildings. That doesn't mean that there won't be specific places where it might be harder for the grid because it's not as robustly built out, but broadly on a whole, we have plenty of electrical capacity from our summer peak to accommodate this.
And I would add to that, that's one of the reasons that grid integration is an important part of the overlay, is allowing buildings to be more responsive to the availability of renewable energy on the grid. And then storage also allows, an even greater responsiveness to renewable energy on the grid, to be able to store renewable energy and then use it. And that can mean batteries, but it doesn't just mean batteries for energy storage. Water heating is quite the energy storage opportunity. And that's why those sorts of requirements are also included in the decarb overlay. It doesn't completely solve that issue because a lot of those are grid level issues, but it does help with those issues. And it is an important part of decarbonizing our buildings, is to make sure that they are supporting grid decarbonization.
That's right. And there was an element of the Energize Denver ordinance that requires that water heaters be demand responsive capable in the future in Denver for that reason.
Okay.
You can take that if you want. Just I thought it would be helpful to answer that question.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. It's actually, I'm glad it came up and you had it. I did just want to mention, so Brendan Hall from Energy Star is on this webinar, and he does mention that there is a goal to add refrigerant tracking to the portfolio manager in the future. So I think that might happen. So good.
Thanks, Brendan.
Sean, there was just a question about just, the decarb code, obviously it's for jurisdictions, but like, is that something that, say, a state school building authority could adopt as a policy for, the school construction within the state? Or is it really, I mean, is it really just has to be kind of a jurisdictional thing, or is it open to other sort of entities to adopt?
No, really any entity can adopt it. I think that sometimes our thinking might be a little too calcified about, this is energy code and this is something else. They're generally all the same types of requirements. It's more about who's adopting it and what buildings are making subject. So, a state authority could adopt it for state-owned buildings or state-regulated buildings, like, schools is a great example of that. And these could be adopted as an overlay to the existing energy code requirements. And here's a bunch of additional requirements. Really, all that would need to be done is they would need to be renumbered so that they could be a nice, clean, standalone document, or they could be adopted as an overlay. So that's certainly an option for anyone who regulates buildings in any capacity, could really utilize these requirements for those buildings.
Okay. I think just given the time, we're pretty much at time. There are so many more questions. And so Sean and Katrina, I'll work with you to kind of make sure that we, answer as many of these as we can. There's some common themes in there, so I think we can consolidate them. But I do want to just take a minute and just remind everybody that this session is being recorded. Both the recording, so for on-demand viewing, and the slide decks will be available on the MBI website, and we'll send a link out after to all the registrants. If folks couldn't make it, they can still access it. And any questions, we have the contact information on the slide, so you guys can direct those to either Sean or Kim Cheslak, who's our codes director at MBI, and Katrina. And I just really want to thank you guys for sharing. If you have any final thoughts you want to share, we would love to hear them. But I think this is, just so you guys know, this is the registration for this webinar was a record for MBI. That's really saying something. And so I think this topic is really very much top of mind for folks. And so I want to just make sure that, we make as much information available as possible and get these questions answered. So if you guys have final thoughts, otherwise I'll go ahead and close the session.
My big final thought, because I'm an existing buildings guy, is that I really do think existing buildings are the key to the climate challenge, and they really do need our focus. And so doing things like adopting the overlay, going through the process like Denver has done, that's really forward thinking, that's thinking about the problem and really trying to address it. And so, yeah, I do think our existing buildings are the future.
I agree. Thank you all so much for being here today, and thanks for having me, MBI.
Yeah, very much appreciated. And the work that you guys are doing in Denver City and County, it's really a great model for everyone. So thank you. All right, everybody will sign off, say thank you so much. And check out MBI's webinar or events page for future webinars. So there'll be more to come on this. All right, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.